the program. So let me turn the program over to Kevin. I would probably suggest that all of the rest of you mute yourselves so that dogs barking, bells ringing, coughing fits don't have you suddenly appear as the speaker on the screen. And I will wait a minute. I don't want to mute Kevin. So let me see if I can make this all work. I think I can. So Kevin, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lou. So it's great to be back. I thank Lynn Keelhorn for giving me this opportunity, and for you folks for showing up on a Thursday evening. I'm going to share my screen. So I did a PowerPoint, and we were joking about PowerPoints. I'm not real good with them, but they do help to guide things. So let me say this. Is this from 7 to 8? Is that generally what you?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
So I could talk forever on the death penalty. I was not just a founding member of Delaware Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, but of Delaware Citizens Opposed to the Death Penalty. Literally 32 years ago this month, we had our first meeting. So I'm kind of a death penalty nerd, and I've studied it a lot over the years. I've represented a lot of people. So I broke this down into really 5 parts actually. I have the history of the death penalty in Delaware. We can go through that rather quickly if it's not to your interest. I have a bit on, some of the reasons why you might be opposed to the death penalty as a citizen of the state of Delaware. I have a section on my experiences where I can tell some stories that I think are meaningful with respect to my opposition to the death penalty. I can talk a little bit about the 2 House bills that are currently before the Delaware General Assembly, HB 70 and HB 301, and then maybe do some question and answer. So I'm going to try. The wiggle room I'll leave is the my stories part, because sometimes they can be lengthy, and I don't want to do all the talking tonight. I'd rather listen to you folks and maybe share some ideas or answer some questions or whatever. So how do I move forward? What do? I click? Yep, that's what I do. So the history of capital punishment in Delaware goes back many centuries. First known execution in Delaware that is recorded is in 1662. In 1731, Catherine Bevan was burned alive for the murder of her husband. That bothered me when I first read that little tidbit, and I did some research on it myself as to wow, that wasn't even cruel back in the 18th century to burn someone alive. Well, apparently it wasn't for treason. If you committed treason, and I thought, wow, killing your husband is treason. Well, because of Catherine's position as his wife, he was subservient. She was subservient to him, and killing your master was considered minor treason and was punishable by burning as opposed to hanging, which was the normal means by which we executed people in the early part of the 18th century. Fast forward to 1958, and Delaware, with the endorsement of our governor, then Caleb Boggs, and our attorney general, then was Januar Bove, abolished the death penalty. And then it came back in less than 3 years. Why did it come back? I did some research into that myself, and there's no specific reason that it came back, but oftentimes bad cases make for bad laws, and the death penalty is no stranger to that. What had happened, as best we can tell, is there'd been some fairly high-profile killings, particularly in the southern part of our state, involving white victims and Black perpetrators. And so at the time, there was a lot of racial unrest. We'd had Brown versus Board of Education just a couple of years before that, integrating our schools. There were lawsuits pending in Delaware seeking to integrate restaurants and hotels. And there was a lot of unrest going on. And so in reaction to these violent crimes, Delaware brought back the death penalty. It was voted on by the General Assembly, and a new death penalty bill passed. But Elbert Carvel, who was then the governor, vetoed that legislation. But they had a sufficient number of legislators that they were able to override his veto. And so we brought back the death penalty. And then in 1972, the United States Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, decided that the death penalty essentially throughout the United States was unconstitutional. Each state had to look at it themselves. So the Delaware Supreme Court, in a case called State versus Dickerson, decided that our death penalty at the time was unconstitutional under the holding in Furman. 1974, we passed a new capital punishment law making the death penalty mandatory for first-degree murder. The evil that had been identified throughout the United States by the Supreme Court, by the 5 members of the court who voted in Furman to find it unconstitutional, was that there was unbridled discretion. As Potter Stewart said, getting the death penalty was about as likely to happen as being struck by lightning. There was no rhyme or reason to why you would get the death penalty. And what that really translated into was there was nothing the courts could look at to say, this is why this person got the death penalty and this is why this person didn't. Usually it was because of means by racial means, whether the victim was white or the perpetrator was black. But the Supreme Court didn't specifically hold that. So Delaware, in its infinite wisdom, said, okay, you don't want all that discretion, we'll just make it mandatory for first-degree murderers to get the death penalty. And so then in 1976, the United States Supreme Court reinstates the death penalty in Gregg versus Georgia, but there were a number of companion cases, one of which was Woodson versus North Carolina, which decided that the mandatory death penalty was unconstitutional. So Delaware had backed the wrong constitutional horse, and so we again had to rewrite our death penalty statute. And it undid the 9 death sentences that had happened between 1974 and 1977. So we wrote our statute to comply with the one that had been found constitutional by the court in Georgia, in Gregg versus Georgia. Fast forward to 1986. At that time, Delaware's death penalty was the way you got killed was by hanging, and states didn't like hanging or electrocution or the gas chamber. It was becoming more and more difficult to carry out those executions, and so Texas had adopted a method of a 3-drug protocol that they would inject into the inmate. And it was like, as Ronald Reagan said, putting your horse to sleep. And so this seemed like a humane method of executing people. Now, what happened to the remaining people who were on death row at that time, who had been sentenced to be hung? Well, part of the law was that they would be given the option of converting their sentence to lethal injection. So when it came time to execute them, they were given that choice. And the assumption was everybody would accept lethal injection. Not so, we'll find out in a few minutes. So in 1991, some of you may remember Brooks Armored Car, one of its armored cars was robbed by 4 gentlemen from Chester, African Americans, who shot the 2 white guards and killed them and stole the contents of an armored car truck. They went to trial. All were found guilty in a 4-person trial, and 1 juror held out against the death penalty. And so there was a public outcry that these horrible men who had killed these armored car guards did not get the death sentence. And so our General Assembly went into special session and enacted a law that was the same essentially as Florida's law, which allowed for juries to make recommendations as to what the sentence should be, but in the end, the judge would make the decision in a system called judicial override, where the judge can override the jury's recommendation, and as long as they find the aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating circumstances, that became our new method of sentencing people to death. Up to that point, we'd only sentenced 5 people to death since 1977. Thereafter, we sentenced a lot of people to death. Judicial override, which was meant to thwart the rogue juror, the 11-to-1 situation, turned into situations where you had 7-to-5 votes in favor of death getting a death sentence. And the first execution that we had was in 1992, and that was Stephen Brian Pennell. Some may remember him as the Route 40 serial killer, who was preying upon sex workers who were working the Route 40 corridor. And he was believed to have killed 4, maybe 5 of those sex workers. And he waived his appeals and became our first execution in March of 1992, which in turn gave birth to Delaware Citizens Opposed to the Death Penalty. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sally Milbury Steen, but Sally used to be the executive director of an organization called Pacem in Terris. She put an ad in a newspaper, in the Delaware News Journal, saying, hey, if you're interested in abolishing the death penalty, come on out to Grace Presbyterian Church, where we met in the basement, and about 30 of us started an organization that we called Delaware Citizens Opposed to the Death Penalty. And that was in April of 92. In 1996, as I alluded to earlier, Billy Bailey chose to be executed by hanging. Actually, he didn't choose to be executed by hanging. He refused to exercise his choice to revert to lethal injection. He said, and this came from his lawyer at the time, whom I knew quite well, Billy said, I don't want to be killed, so I'm not going to participate in the choice in how I'm to be killed. And so he refused to sign the piece of paper that said he could be executed by lethal injection. And this gave the Department of Corrections a lot of angst, because Billy was a short, heavy-set man with not much of a neck. He looked like a weeble, if you know what that is, the little things that your kids can knock down and they pop right back up. And he was not going to be easy to be hung. And hanging is not something that is an easy thing to do. There's a specific physics to it. The way that you do the knot is such that you have to drop a certain number of feet based upon your weight. And that knot is supposed to snap your neck when you hit the base of the drop. And that's how you die. Not choking to death at the end of a rope, which is something you want to avoid. But you also don't want to make the drop too far, because it'll yank your head off. And these are all real things that happen. And so the Army had prescribed methods by which you can execute somebody. So Delaware had to create a gallows, figure out how far they needed to drop Billy Bailey, and they executed him by hanging in 1996. Then in 2002, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Ring versus Arizona. And in Ring, they decided that the specific thing that made you eligible for the death penalty, that is a statutory aggravating circumstance, they made it akin to an element of the offense of capital murder. So they said a jury has to decide that under the Sixth Amendment. And so Delaware had to change its method of imposing the death penalty to comply with Ring versus Arizona. So we changed our capital punishment system again, having the one that we had in place found unconstitutional. The Ring decision was not retroactively applicable, so all those people who had been found eligible for the death penalty under the pre-Ring statute were still going to be executed, and in fact they were. 2003, the last person who had been eligible for the death penalty by hanging had been executed by lethal injection, so we took down our gallows. 2012, Jack Markell, who was opposed to the death penalty, on the eve of Robert Gaddis's execution, granted him clemency. it was some tremendous work done by the Delaware Capital Habeas Unit and the Philadelphia Capital Habeas Unit that discovered a lot of mitigating evidence that had not been presented in Robert Gaddis's case. He was actually a client of mine for a period of time. Robert and I still correspond. I visit him every Christmas, and he's notwithstanding the fact that he committed a murder, he's a very nice person, very intelligent. We have great conversations. And he is the one and only person who was ever granted clemency and taken off of Delaware's death row on the eve of his execution. Fast forward to 2016, a case called Ralph, R-A-U-F versus State is decided. And it was decided because a case by the U.S. Supreme Court called Hurst versus Florida was decided, where they determined that not just the statutory aggravating circumstances, but all of the facts that are necessary to be found to sentence you to death must be found by a jury of your peers under the Sixth Amendment. And so again, we had a situation where the death penalty statute that we'd put in place was found to be unconstitutional. And so in 2016, Delaware's death penalty statute was found unconstitutional. So as it stands today, we have a death penalty statute, but it's not constitutional procedurally. That same year, in a case called Powell versus State, the court determined that their decision in Ralph versus State was to be applied retroactively. And so the 13 remaining inmates who were on death row had their sentences converted to life without parole. And so in the period between 1992 and 2012, when we had our last execution, Delaware executed 16 inmates, which is a lot. And we were actually third in the nation by a per capita, or by the size of our state, in the number of executions that we had. Second only to Oklahoma and Texas. So the reasons to abolish the death penalty. The first one is Delawareans overwhelmingly support abolition. The rest of the nation, it's about 50-50 on abolition. Delaware, the Delaware Center for Justice conducted a poll in 2015 that indicated that 64% of Delawareans, when given the choice between life without parole and death, supported life in prison, and 30% supported the death penalty. Those are pretty striking numbers, but they mirror, a national trend toward, popularity of the death penalty. It continues to go down and down each year. Second point is it's not a deterrent. That's a really hard case to make. And for most years, people have said, it's a toss-up. But recent studies that have been much more scientific in nature have indicated there is no deterrent effect attributable to death penalty statutes. And I have the site there. If I can share at some point, I can share, I guess, my PowerPoint, or actually, if it's being recorded, you'll have that. But also, you should understand that both the homicide and violent crime rates in Delaware have been on the decline actually since 1994, but have continued to decline precipitously since 2016, when we got rid of the death penalty. Whether the two are associated, I can't tell you. Correlation does not imply causation. I think that's what scientists tell us. But the fact of the matter is that violent crime rate continues to go down, as does the murder rate. We had some little blips during the pandemic when we had some unusual circumstances in Delaware and across the nation. But for the most part, if you look at the trend line, it's been on the way down since 1994. Probably one of the biggest reasons, if you're looking for empirical reasons or data-based reasons, is that seeking the death penalty is an incredible waste of our limited criminal justice resources. It costs a lot to seek the death penalty. A lot of people think, well, it's because of all the appeals that they take years on down the line. That's not the reason. It's actually the super due process that you are entitled to when you have a death penalty trial means that we invest incredible amounts of resources. every study that's been shown has agreed with that notion. Probably the best one was one done by the Urban Institute several years ago for the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland asked, they wanted some unassociated think tank to do a look at the death penalty, and they studied Maryland's death penalty, and they determined basically that if you started a case from the beginning seeking life without parole as opposed to seeking the death penalty, it costs 3 times as much seeking the death penalty as it did seeking life without parole. And so it's an incredible waste of our limited criminal justice resources. Furthermore, a national poll of chiefs of police say that if you're going to take dollars and put them toward law enforcement, one of our lowest priorities is seeking the death penalty, as opposed to many other things that law enforcement would like to have. There is substantial evidence that racial bias persists in our society, particularly within the criminal justice system. Nationally, when executions have been carried out exclusively for murder, and there's a reason I put it that way, because for many years it was used for rape as well, and almost exclusively for blacks raping whites. And so the number would actually be much higher if we included rape. That was done away with in a case called Coker versus Georgia in 1976. But prior to that, that was where you saw throughout the Death Belt, most of the executions were coming from, executions for people for rape. But it's 75% of the cases involved the murder of a white victim. And so that's what most of the studies shown. The first was a study done by a Professor Baldus from Iowa State. He was a brilliant man, a brilliant statistician, and he did a really great study which showed that it wasn't necessarily the color of the perpetrator that drove the death penalty, it was the color of the victim. And we tend to value as a society white lives more than we do black lives, is what his conclusion was. And so despite the fact that half the victims of homicide nationwide are black, 75% of the cases where we've sentenced people to death are for executing or for killing white people. It's even worse in Delaware. A 2012 study of the death penalty in Delaware. That site is a great study. It's done by the Cornell Death Penalty Project, led by John Bloom and several other tremendous legal minds and smart people. And they did a study of the death penalty between 1970 and 2012 and showed that Black defendants who kill white victims are more than 3 times as likely to be sentenced to death as white defendants who kill white victims. One of the misconceptions is that murder victims' families uniformly support the death penalty. If you've ever met a young lady who is an activist locally, her name is Kristen Freilich. She was president of Delaware Citizens Opposed to the Death Penalty. Her brother was murdered up in Connecticut when Connecticut had the death penalty. And she's very opposed to the death penalty and can explain, based on her experience and her family's experience of them seeking the death penalty for the gentleman who killed her brother and 3 of his roommates in an apartment. So there's a lot of scholarship now out there, and that I cite one of them from Marquette that shows that the death penalty doesn't bring closure and actually interferes with the healing process for victims' family members. And it's a very interesting study. So it's a very complex question as to whether or not murder victims' families support the death penalty. And I can actually share the story of a woman that I know quite well. Probably the other reason, and I can't read this quote because I have to move but you can read it yourself. There's no evidence, and this is by Kathy Jennings, who's our current Attorney General. She said back in 2020, there's no evidence that the death penalty is any more to deterrent to murder, any more an enhancement of public safety, or any more restorative, a restoration of justice than a life sentence. But there's ample evidence nationally that there is bias in the use of capital punishment. Execution costs taxpayers more than life sentences, and that as the state sanctions execution, there will always exist a possibility, however remote, that we might have an innocent life which we cannot give back. Take an innocent life which we cannot give back. So our chief law enforcement officer in the state of Delaware is opposed to the death penalty. So those are the data-driven, the empirical reasons why you might oppose capital punishment. So my experiences are more personal. I have been toiling in this vineyard since, in the anti-death penalty work since 1992. But before that, I've been representing people as a lawyer, both people at the trial level, at the appeal level, at the state and federal post-conviction level. And one of the first people I was ever appointed to represent was a gentleman by the name of Andre Deputy. His is a very long story, and so I'm going to just give you the truncated version of my relationship with Andre. I didn't get him as a client until federal post-conviction, which is really the end of the line. I got a call. I was a sole practitioner at the time. I was not a public defender, but I was doing indigent work as what is known as a conflict lawyer. I got a call from the then Chief Judge of the Delaware U.S. District Court, Joseph Farnan. And Judge Farnan asked me if I would represent Andre because his lawyers that had been representing him at the state level had to withdraw from the case, and he needed a lawyer, and he had an execution date looming. And so when a federal judge asks you to do something, you usually say yes, and I did say yes. So I got to know Andre. I first went down and saw him down at Sussex Correctional Institution. At that time, we had no death row. He was in general population down there. And I met him. I talked to him. He was a quiet man. And then I picked up the boxes of his materials from the lawyers who previously represented him. They were in Dover. And I began to get to know him through the many decisions that had been rendered in his case, the records of relating to his background, his upbringing, and all that. And I got to know him through the paper files, as it were. It would take several years before I would really get to know Andre Deputy, the person. But what I learned about him is that Andre had grown up on Wilmington's east side. He was not the youngest, not the oldest of 10 kids living in poverty. When he was 7 years old, an older sister's boyfriend burst into their home with a shotgun because he believed that the older sister had been cheating on him. Andre's mother stepped in between the two, and she took a shotgun blast and was killed in their living room right in front of Andre and several of his siblings. That had a profound effect on Andre. In school, he was at age 10 soiling himself. He would sit and stare out the window, and he rarely participated in class. So eventually he was sent to the Terry Center, where he lived for 3 years, which was the mental health facility for younger people at the time in Delaware. Nobody came from his family to visit him during those 3 years. He was released when he was 13 years old. He went home. He got caught by his father, who was an evangelical minister, drinking, and his father threw him out. And he lived like a feral cat, is the best way I can describe it, on the streets for many years until, and he never got involved in violent crime. He would steal, he would do, he was using drugs, he was drinking, he was doing, different things that were antisocial. But he ended up down in Harrington, Delaware, working in a chicken processing plant with his cousin, a fellow by the name of William Flamer. One night one time in early February, they were of 1979, they were on a drinking binge. They went to Byard and Alberta Smith, who were Flamer's aunt and uncle, and they wanted to borrow money because they were out of money, and they knew that the Smiths had just gotten their Social Security check. It was the beginning of the month. The Smiths refused them, and a fight ensued, and Byard and Alberta were stabbed to death by Andre and by William Flamer. Andre went to jail. The two were ultimately tried separately, convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts, and sentenced to death each. Andre was a chain smoker. And back then in the early mid-'80s, you could smoke while in prison. And he got into a scuffle with a guard once, and he was put in the hold for 30 days. And while you're in the hole, you can't smoke. And that was tough on Andre. And as he explained it to me one time, he was so desperate for cigarettes that he'd never been a religious person, notwithstanding that his father was a minister. He kneeled down in his cell and he said to God, if you take away this desire for cigarettes, I'll give you my life. And he says he woke up in the morning and he had no desire for cigarettes. And so he held up his end of the bargain, and over the next several years became one of the most powerful forces in the Delaware prison system. And I say powerful not because he was borderline mentally retarded. He had a very low IQ. But I say powerful in the way he lived his life. He became a much better person. He worked hard. He got involved in the Scared Straight program at Sussex Correctional Institution. The guards came to love him. The warden came to love him. He became, friends with people outside the gates who came to visit him. And he was really highly thought of. So much so that fast forward at the end, when we were seeking commutation, there were guards, and the warden from Sussex Correctional Institution actually testified on his behalf, seeking commutation of his sentence to life without parole. I was not successful in my representation of Andre. I visited him every few months down in Sussex, usually to bring bad news. When I would bring that bad news, I would say, well, here's the next step. Do you have any questions? Andre rarely had questions for me, and I would leave. And that was the extent of our relationship. But as we got toward the end, as I realized the courts were not going to give him relief, and that maybe commutation of his sentence by the governor was maybe the only way we were going to be able to do this, I decided it was time that I got to know Andre. And so my visits, instead of explaining the legal positions we had, I started to try to get to know him. And his life experiences were very different than mine. I was a upper middle class, kid from Brandywine 100, with two parents and, gone to college, law school. I'd lived many of the benefits of my life, and his life was much different. So I tried to find some commonality, and our commonality landed on our common Christian faith. And I'll say Andre was more of an Old Testament Christian, and I was more of a New Testament Christian. I'm more of a kind of a Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton progressive Catholic, and he's a hellfire and brimstone Protestant. But we shared our favorite stories. Andre's favorite story was from the book of Daniel. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Jewish priests who were executed, or at least attempted to be executed by the Assyrian king when they would not worship his golden statue. And he loved that story. He would read it to me occasionally, and I would read to him. My favorite passages were the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and the Acts of the Apostles. Actually, for weird reasons, one of my favorites was the Council of Jerusalem story. So we would share those. We would talk about that, and we got to be actually fairly good friends. And it came the night of Andre's execution, and that was the early morning hours of June 23rd, 1994. And sadly enough, the last person you're allowed to have in your cell, the only person you're allowed to have in your cell during that last 24 hours, is your lawyer. Who's the last person you'd want in your cell? I think it would be my lawyer. But I was in Andre's cell with him that night, and the execution trailer at that time was two trailers literally put together. One was where the cell was, and the other was where the execution chamber was. So at midnight, they took me out of his cell, and they put me in the viewing chamber. And that night, I had been very angry. I wasn't showing it. I was trying to be supportive of Andre. I was talking with him. We were sharing stories. 3 of his sisters visited him. His father actually visited him. I felt like I was on sacred ground, sitting and watching them interact like a family sitting around a kitchen table. And they took me out, and I decided, I cooked up this plan in my sleepless head that I was going to stare down James T. Vaughn, who was the previous commissioner of corrections. He was a senator, not the Judge Vaughn, that's his son, but the senator prided himself on being at every execution. And I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stare down Judge Vaughn, or not Judge Vaughn, Senator Vaughn, when he comes through the doors into the trailer, because he's going to be the one to look the other way, because he's going to know that I'm on the moral high ground here. He's wrong and I'm right. I don't know why I cooked up that idea. But I was pissed off. I was angry at what was happening. I wasn't pissed off at the guards or the warden who was going to execute, give the order to execute him. I wasn't pissed off at the jurors who voted for execution, or the judge who pronounced it, or the prosecutors who fought so hard to see that he gets the death penalty and that it would be carried out. I was mad at the politicians who would use Andre as a political tool to show that they're tough on crime. And that's why I wanted to stare down Senator Vaughn. So I was actually the first person they put in the viewing room. And there's this big curtain in front of this window that we were all going to be standing in front of. They didn't have it separated or anything. And the curtain suddenly opened, and there lies Andre, prostrate on the gurney, already strapped down. And his eyes were closed and he had a smile on his face. And in that moment, all the anger went out of me. And I had no desire to stare down, thank God, Senator Vaughn. And Franciscan friar, who's a good friend of mine at the time, had the wisdom to say to me, Kevin, you shouldn't drive yourself home that night. I'll drop you off and I'll wait for you. I'll be part of the protest group outside and I'll give you a ride home. So he was driving me home that night. And I remember saying to myself, I think I'm starting to, understand why Andre, I'm getting emotional. I had a shrink one time tell me, you may be done with the past, but the past isn't done with you. And I'm still not done with my past with Andre. And I'm sorry. But I started to find some meaning in Andre's story that night. And I think what Andre was trying to teach me for years was the fiery furnace in that story. And if you recall, the evil king had put them in this furnace because the three Jewish priests would not worship his golden statue, and he wanted to see them burned to death. And he opened the doors only to see them walking in a circle, singing hymns of praise, and a fourth person, as if the Son of Man is the language that's used in the book of Daniel, walking with them. And I never really got that story until the night of Andre's execution. And I think what Andre was trying to teach me is that the fiery furnace that we have is the furnace of our hearts, and that we shouldn't be consumed by the anger that we have. And the person who delivered me from my anger that night was a condemned prisoner. So a few weeks later, I'm really sorry. I haven't told that story in a long time. I'm really sorry.
No apologies necessary. No apologies necessary.
I didn't realize it was going to get to me this much. Anyway, a few weeks later, I was able to go down to Sussex Correctional Institution. The chapel down there, they had a memorial service for Andre. And I remember that I was there, and they dedicated a podium up in the balcony, because the balcony is where they would put the maximum security prisoners, and the general population was down in the main part of the chapel. And I was in the main part of the chapel, and Andre used to sing beautifully from up in the balcony. And they were dedicating the podium up there to him and his memory. And there's this part of a Protestant service. My mom was Protestant, so I'd gone to a lot of Protestant services, where I'll call it the call, where they say, anybody who wants to give their life over to Christ, anybody who wants to, be born again, come down, come forward. And other than a few times at my mom's church when, like an arranged baptism would happen, I'd never really seen anybody come down. But at that point of the service that day, when the preacher called for anybody who wanted to be born again, suddenly there was this just herd of prisoners who moved down to the front of the sanctuary, and all of them kneeling, some of them crying. It was just this really moving situation. And I was just like, holy crap, this is amazing. And I thought to myself, that's amazing. Like Andre's had that impact on them. And then as I'm driving back from Sussex later that day, the feeling that I got, the good old Kevin, not really. I thought to myself, of all those guys who were prepared to turn their life over to Christ, a lot of them, when they get out, they're probably going to return to the same criminal lifestyle that they were a part of, before they went behind bars. But then, I don't know if it was Andre whispering to me, I thought to myself, but if just one of them, if just one changed their life, then it was all worthwhile. And what Andre had taught me is that no man, no woman is beyond redemption. And he had been redeemed. I'm running out of time. Alice Marinopoulos, Alice M. I tried to I just blew her anonymity, is a woman who was head of an organization called Friends and Families of Murder Victims. I got to know her in 1994 when we invited a woman to speak to Delaware citizens opposed to the death penalty. It was a public program on why we should get rid of the death penalty in Delaware. And there's a bunch of these people sitting in the back who I didn't recognize. I thought, oh, this is great. There was almost 100 people at our meeting. I was really happy about it. And then when she opened it up to questioning, suddenly this group pulled up a bunch of posters and they were saying, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You don't know what it's like to be, to lose a person to murder. And they were members of Alice's group called Friends and Families of Murder Victims. And what could have turned into an ugly version of the Jerry Springer show turned into actually a good back and forth. And we found some commonality. And what I also learned that night is that I had a huge blind spot in my life. I had not really looked at things from the perspective of people who had lost loved ones to murder. And so I professed to start going to their monthly meetings, which I did. And I didn't make every meeting, but I made a lot of them. I became their favorite whipping boy. They loved to just, be angry with me about this criminal justice system. But Alice and I developed this kind of love-hate relationship where she became like a second mother to me. She would call my house a lot. And at the time I had young daughters. My daughters were like 6 and 3 years old and, maybe a little bit older than that. And she would call my house during the daytime and my wife would answer. My wife knew her because my wife had actually grown up in the same neighborhood as Alice and her son who'd been murdered, and she knew them. The way it would go is Alice would call and she'd say, hi, hon, is Kevin there? And my wife would say, no, she's not, Alice. He's not, he's at work. I can give you his number. Oh, I have it. Don't worry. How are you doing? And she would end up talking to my wife for a while. And so I would think to myself, I think she's trying to do the smartest thing to get a person to change their mind on an issue is to go to his wife. If you convince the wife, the wife will convince the husband that he's wrong. But I came to realize that there was something very different going on, is that the conversations between Alice and my wife were about changing diapers and taking kids to soccer practice and dance class and school and, parent-teacher meetings and things like that. And what I came to realize is that Alice, as much as she said she wanted her son's killer killed, what she really needed was us. And that human beings, the most difficult thing to look into is the eyes of pain. And we shun the Alice Marinopoulos of the world just as much as we shun the Andre Deputies of the world. We don't want to look at them. They're a painful part of our existence. And so what we want to do is just kill their loved one's killer and say, there, you're whole now. You've got closure. And really what Alice needed was connection to life again. She needed people who would just sit in the ministry of presence and be with her and listen to her and listen to her pain, but also talk to her about life and reconnect her to her own life. Stuart Dotz was I'll make this much shorter. He was a juror in the James Cook trial. I defended a gentleman by the name of James Cook, who is convicted of killing Lindsay Bonestell, who was a sophomore at the University of Delaware, when he raped, strangled, and set her on fire in her own apartment. Stuart was juror number 6 on that trial. He was a science teacher from Newark High who supported the death penalty, at least in theory, until after that trial. And he wrote actually a very persuasive op-ed for the News Journal saying that although he supported the death penalty in theory, we need to get rid of it. And we need to get rid of it because of the collateral damage. And the collateral damage is what it does to us as people. And he talked about how the jurors just all that they had to go through in listening to the horrible details of this murder, but also the horrible details of James Cook's life, and then actually make decisions about life and death. And he saw people change in that jury room. It profoundly affected them. And he thought it was wrong. But he said it's not just them, it's the judge, it's the lawyers, it's the court staff, it's the prison guards, it's all the people that we give this job to, this dirty business of capital punishment to, that really brought him to believe that we need to get rid of the death penalty. Anyway, those are my experiences. The last slide, there's two bills pending before the Delaware House of Representatives. One is HB 70. It's a straight repeal of the death penalty. It's very straight and simple. You need a simple majority, 21 in the House, 11 in the Senate, to advance the bill to the governor. The other bill is HB 301. It's an amendment to the Delaware's Constitution to prohibit the death penalty as being a form of punishment sanctioned by our state. Because it's a constitutional amendment, it would need 2/3 vote, which would be 28 votes in the House and 14 in the Senate. And you need to do it in 2 consecutive sessions. So it's really a firewall against the death penalty ever coming back. So the question a lot of people ask me is, we don't really have the death penalty in Delaware. The courts did away with it. Why should we care about abolishing it legislatively? Well, here's what I'll tell you. As you can tell from the history of the death penalty in Delaware, we're one bad crime away from bringing it back. Some police officer is going to get shot. Some child who's been raped is going to be murdered to shut them up. Some teacher is going to be killed. Something really, really horrible is going to happen. And there's going to be a firestorm of public pressure in the General Assembly to bring back the death penalty. And it'll be back. I mean, it's the same thing that happened in 1991 when the Brooks Armored Car case happened. It's the same thing that happened in 1961 when some bad homicides happened in Delaware. You really need to get rid of it. Why do you need to get rid of it legislatively? Because right now, we have a death penalty statute that is a viable statute, except for the procedure for seeking it. And if you sought to change that procedure under a case called Cohen versus State from our own state of Delaware from the early 90s, you can retroactively apply that to people who have not been sentenced yet. So anybody who had a pending murder charge could be facing the death penalty in Delaware. And that's a fairly, daunting proposition as far as I'm concerned. So that's why I believe we need to do away with it legislatively, not just by straight repeal, but by constitutional amendment. So one of the reasons Lynn Keelhorn said, would you like to speak to our Peace and Justice group, is we'd like you, to in any way you can support both of these bills, whether it's just reaching out to your own elected representatives or what have you. So I think that's it. I think that's all that's all my slides. So why don't I stop the share and we'll go back to live. And I know there's only 4 minutes left because I'm such a long-winded loudmouth. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them or try to answer them.
Well, Kevin, we don't ring a bell, and if you'll excuse me, drop a guillotine at 8 o'clock and make everybody stop. Your testimony was powerful, and I think we are all deeply affected by it. So I want to give people the opportunity to perhaps take a deep breath and see what thoughts, what comments, what questions arise. If you would like to say something, it would be helpful if you would either use the raise hand button or raise your hand. Craig?
Yes, I can.
Craig, I don't know if you're speaking, but we can't hear you. You're not muted, but we can't hear you. It must be something with your microphone.
I'm asked to put it, you want me to put up the last slide? I will do that. Hold on 1 second. Share screen. I think this is it. There. Go backwards. Oh, darn. There we are.
Sheridan, did you have a question or a comment?
No, I wanted the slides. I just took a screenshot of them. Thank you.
Okay.
I think it's being recorded also, so I think that you'll have the ability to access all of this. And I'm even happy to email to Sue or Lynn or both my slideshow if you want to just, pull up some of the links that were in the thing. I can share with you this. We have an organization of people that is different than Delaware Citizens Opposed to Death Penalty. It's like a working group that meets every 2 weeks to support this legislation. We've developed a toolkit that I can send you that has facts, figures, sample letters, things like that, that you can use to, whether it's a phone message you want to leave for your elected representative or an email you want to send. I'll tell you that phone messages, texts, if you have your elected representative's cell phone number, are generally the most powerful thing. Emails, they generally get looked at by legislative assistants, but they will collect them and give them to their your elected representative. I can tell you that our what we would call a whip count in the House has us at around 24 votes in favor of abolition, which means that we're about 4 shy of the 28 you would need to get the constitutional amendment, but we are above the number that I think we need to get straight repeal. In the Senate, the numbers are a little bit better. I think we're at 14, which is right on the number for both the constitutional amendment and straight repeal. And I can let people know who I'll tell you right now, one of the key people to reach out to is both bills are in the House. They've come out of their respective committees and they're on what's called the ready list for the House floor. The Speaker of the House like the Speaker of the House in Congress, has the unique power, and it's a big power, that they can bring forward legislation at their will. It's their discretion to bring forth legislation. And Valerie Longhurst is the Speaker of the House, and she has not indicated to anyone where she stands on this legislation and her intentions as to bringing the bills forward. I believe that she will bring them forward because there's such a strong, within her own Democratic caucus, there is a strong voice for getting these bills on the floor. In fact, the former Speaker of the House, Pete Schwarzkopf, in committee said that although he does not support the bills, he voted to have them come out because he believes they deserve their day on the floor. So getting them to the floor, hopefully in May, so that they can go over to the bills can go over to the Senate and get their committee hearings and get to the Senate floor in this session is the goal. There are some people within the Democratic caucus who we would like to see, move to our side of the equation. There are some Republicans who are on our side. I think that Representative Ramon, Representative Mike Smith from Newark are both in favor of abolition. The Republican caucus is fairly solid against it. But we're hopeful that we can get a few more members of that caucus to come over, especially in the House. I don't know
if you would send me that information, I would be happy to forward along to folks so that they can see who's involved, who's engaged, and what action would be helpful. That would be great.
I'll be happy to do that.
And for some reason, I'm not on the screen, but I'm here.
You're on my screen.
Oh, good. All right, I'm not on mine. James, I'll get you in a minute, but Roger's had his hand up. So, Roger?
More just a comment. The weekly series by John Oliver had I guess it was just last Sunday, had a
Yes.
whole half hour on, or 40 minutes on on the mechanics of the death penalty and how things can go wrong so easily and how difficult it is to accomplish it in what is supposedly not burning people at the stake anymore, but supposedly a humane manner. And the other major point was that the death by lethal injection is such a problem because nobody wants to make the drugs. So I think
Right.
the trend in this country is getting rid of it for every reason that Kevin has said, and a lot of others as well.
And of course, the work
do-
of Brian Stevenson in identifying people wrongly sentenced to death. It's unconscionable to think that there could be that degree of error rate and that we are somehow willing to accept that is difficult to wrap my mind around. Anyway, I think for many people, if nothing else, it is the idea that because of, in many instances, deficiencies or issues with our criminal justice system and the biases that are employed result in people not guilty being wrongfully sentenced to death is unconscionable. James, you're muted.
Sue, can you
Okay.
unmute? Oh, there
Can you
we
hear
go.
me?
Yeah, I can't. I have the power to mute everybody, but I can't unmute anybody.
Yeah, there you go. We can hear you, James.
There you go.
Thank you, AG, for the time accorded to explain the heinous penalty of death that, that to me, I think it's unfair based on what Sue just said. There's some innocent people who just, get, under the lethal injection just because something happened and nobody could prove it. But my question would be, what would be the alternative? What would be the alternative?
In Delaware, life without parole is the alternative.
Okay.
I'm not a big fan of life without parole, but it is the alternative. It's the politically most expedient way to get rid of the death penalty is to say to victims' family members and to people who are in favor of the death penalty that at least this person will never breathe free air again. They will come out of a jail in a coffin, only it'll be by natural causes as opposed to at the hands of the state. But I'm not a big fan of life without parole. I believe that we should have some mechanism where people can, it's called the pardon board, but rarely is a person going to get pardoned.
And I think what we know, based on the legislation that was passed by Congress in 1994, that included the 3 strikes rule, 3 felony convictions means life in prison without the possibility of parole. And as I've looked at the statistics, somewhere around half of the people who are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole because of the 3rd strike have never committed a violent crime. So it may be better than the death penalty, but it is not good enough. And that aspect of it.
We'll work on that next.
Thank you. All right, we'll deal with that in series. That's fine.
Sheridan, your question, what are other countries doing? Developed nations will say are primarily almost uniformly opposed to the death penalty and have abolished it. We're in, the company of countries like China, some of the, more backward companies or countries of, of the Middle East, but almost all of the Western democracies are uniformly against it. It's funny, but until we did away with until the Supreme Court did away with executing children in Roper versus Simmons in 2005, we were one of the only nations in the entire world that executed children. Even China didn't execute children. So we were alone with, I think, Somalia at the time that authorized the execution of children. So, we like to see ourselves as a beacon of human rights, and but not so all the time.
Well, I want to thank you again, Kevin, for being here this evening and to speaking so movingly and powerfully about this issue. The title of tonight's topic was Killing in the Name of Justice. And it is clearly an oxymoron, even in its fundamentals. And so I thank you for giving us the information about action that we can take, not just those of us here tonight, but our friends, our neighbors, our families, to encourage people we know to make their voices heard in our legislature as these bills are being considered.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to address this group. Really, this is what we've been doing for the last 32 years, is getting into the civic organizations and churches and schools as much as we can to talk to people and to, open their eyes. This is a fault line issue. It's one that's oftentimes decided in people's guts as opposed to, based on facts. It's their life experiences. So we try to share as many of the experiences we can with people. And thank you for taking the time out of your, personal lives to listen to me tonight. And anything you can do, to help us in this, thank you so much. And feel free to reach out to me. When I share this toolkit with Sue and with Lynn, I will be sure that I include my own email address. And if you have questions after tonight, you can feel free to reach out to me anytime you like. But thank you so much for this opportunity, and have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Kevin.
you very much,
Right.
and for the work you're doing.
All right.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, all.